A last stand is a military situation in which a body of troops holds a defensive position in the face of overwhelming and virtually insurmountable odds. The year is 961 AD in a little town in western Norway. A man sits eating his breakfast when suddenly the door swings open. "I come bearing words of an approaching army," the man states. The army he is speaking of is the Danish army. They had just achieved complete surprise, having sailed all the way from Denmark, and now only moments away. The person still eating his lunch and being the last to learn of the impending invasion was the King of Norway himself. There was no time to flee, nor gather any sort of sizable army. They would have to stand and fight with the man at hand. At the point of contact, the Danes would outnumber the Norwegians by 6-1. Overwhelming and virtually insurmountable odds. This is the complete, mapped out and animated saga of King Haakon I of Norway, or more commonly known as just King Haakon the Good. Before starting on the saga, we need to look at the events leading up to this. The King's Sagas is a book that is extremely interwoven and connected, so starting in the middle of the book like this poses some challenges. But let's get up to speed with where we are and what has happened up to this point. During the latter half of the 1800s AD, the Kingdom of Norway is united under one king, Harald Fairhair. He had many sons, and among them 2 are of interest to us, those being Erik Bloodaxe and Haakon the Good. After King Harald had died, Erik Bloodaxe fought and killed many of his own brothers, and eventually became the sole king of Norway. Meanwhile, Haakon had been adopted by the English king, Athelstan, and he grew up there, being raised as a Christian. A chapter marker corresponding to the book will be shown in the top right corner throughout the video. And now, with some context, we are ready to begin where the saga starts. Haakon was in England when he learned of the death of his father, the King of Norway. He right away began preparing to travel back home to Norway to claim his throne. The King of England, Athelstan, gave him a sizable fleet and made him richly outfitted for his journey. He arrived home during autumn and heard that his brother, Eirik, was in the south. He therefore sailed north to Trøndelag, where he met with a local earl, Sigurd. They got accustomed and together formed an alliance of sorts, and became friends. A thing was held, a thing being a form of gathering or meeting, and on this thing all the prominent people of the region was gathered. Here, Sigurd spoke and encouraged everyone to take Haakon as their king. Haakon gave everyone large promises of riches and to give everyone their land back, which the previous king had confiscated from them. This was very popular, and word about this spread throughout the kingdom. When winter came, Haakon traveled over the mountains and into a region known as Upplandene. Here he called thing meetings everywhere he went, and here too, everywhere he went, people took him as their king. He traveled further south and laid large areas of land under himself, and put loyal men in to govern the region for him. When spring came, Haakon gathered a large fleet, intending to take the fight to Eirik. The same was done by his subjects in the south. However, when Eirik tried raising an army himself, he found that many men were unwilling to fight for him, and that many had defected to Haakon. Seeing no other option, Eirik fled west to the Orkneys, and raided both in Scotland and northern England. However, the English king sent an offer to Eirik that he would receive Northumbria from him, and in return he would defend the rest of England from Viking raids. And he would have to convert to Christianity, along with everyone in his fleet. The English king was willing to offer this deal, as he had been good friends with his father. Eirik agreed to these terms, and made York his new home. Eirik was Earl of Northumbria for a long time, until King Athelstan died, and his brother Edmund took the throne. There were rumors that he intended to place a new earl over Northumbria, and so Eric set sail north to the Orkneys to gather men. He then sailed south to Ireland and finally landed with his fleet in the south of England, where a large battle was fought. However, the Norwegians were outnumbered, and for every Englishman that was struck down, 3 more popped up. The battle raged on throughout the day, but by the end, the Norwegians were defeated. The survivors returned to York and gave the bad news to Eric's wife and sons. When Eric's wife, Gunhild, and her sons learned of what had happened, they took everything they could with them and again set sail. This time, they too returned to the Orkneys and Shetland Islands. They stayed there during winters, and during the summers they went on Viking raids in Scotland and Ireland. King Haakon now ruled the entirety of Norway, but he stayed in the west with his army because there was still a chance that Eirik would return. However, when Haakon heard the news of his brother's death, and that his sons no longer had the support of the English king, he deemed the threat of an attack low and set sail south, where Danes had been doing great harm by raiding. As he sailed towards them, the raiders fled back south to Denmark. Haakon followed them to Jutland, where the locals gathered an army, and here they fought a large battle, in which Haakon came out on top. Haakon continued raiding throughout Denmark during the summer, and met no sizable resistance. When autumn came, he sailed back home to Norway, having gained a large amount of plunder. He stayed on high alert during the winter, expecting an attack in retaliation from the Danes. Spring came and no attack had materialized, and so Haakon returned north where his base of power was. In his place he put a man, Trygve, in charge of defending the south in case of an attack. When Gunhild and the Erikssons heard that there was hostilities between Norway and Denmark, they wasted no time in traveling to Denmark where they met with the king. At this time, that was Harald Bluetooth. A close friendship was formed and they were given land and gifts. Raids were conducted by both parties and battles were fought with varying outcome. During the reign of King Haakon, there was peace and good years both on land and sea. Haakon was a kind and social person and with a good sense of law-giving. He was during a Christmas celebrating with Earl Sigurd when his child was born. The king poured water over him and gave him his name, Haakon. The 2 men were best of friends. There was once a conflict during his reign, in which a local king had taken over land from another. He asked the people who they wanted to rule over them, his slave or his dog. The people chose the dog. They believed that they would be able to govern themselves more or less that way. However, the dog had been through magic given the wits of 3 men, so that when he spoke, he barked the first 2 words and spoke the third. The dog met his end one day. Wolves attacked the farm. The dog's guards encouraged the dog to stop the wolves. It ran out and was promptly torn to bits. Because of the conflict, a lot of people fled. One of them were Kjetil Jemte. The region they came to would later be known as Jämtland. And during Haakon's reign, this region became part of Norway, because the locals there heard great things about the Norwegian king. When Haakon first arrived in Norway, he kept his Christian beliefs mostly to himself, and had plans to convert the nation only when he had a firm rule over the country. He felt that time had now come, and so he began first to convert just his close friends and select powerful people. He made it so that Christmas was celebrated at the same time as in Christian Europe. Up until this point, the pagans had started the celebration midwinter. A bishop and priests were invited from England, and the first churches were built. Haakon now made it clear what his intentions were. The whole kingdom was going to follow Christ. A thing gathering was called. There they would discuss the matter. At the thing, Haakon began with stating that he prayed that everyone would follow his example, rich and poor, man and woman, young and old. That everyone would believe in the one true God, Christ. That every 7th day would be a rest day, and fast once a week. Upon hearing this, a man stood up and began to speak. We bonds, King Haakon, when we elected thee to be our king, and got back our feudal rights at the thing held in Trondheim, thought that we had gotten into heaven. But now we don't know whether we really have gotten our freedom, or whether thou wishes to make vassals of us again, by this extraordinary proposal, that we should abandon the ancient faith which our fathers and forefathers have held from the oldest times, in the time when the dead were burnt, as well as since that they are laid under mounds, and which, all through they were braver than the people of our days, has served us a faith to the present time. We have also held thee so dear, that we allowed thee to rule and give law to all the country. Even now we bonds will unanimously hold the law which thou givest us here in the Frostathing, and to which we also given our assent. And we will follow thee, and have thee for our king, as long as there is a man living amongst us bonds here in the Frostathing assembled. But thou, king, must use some moderation towards us, and only request from us such things as we can obey thee in, and are not impossible for us. If, however, thou wilt take up this matter with a high hand, and wilt try thy power and strength against us, we bonds have resolved amongst ourselves to part with thee, and to take to ourselves some other chieftain, who will so conduct himself towards us, that we can freely and safely enjoy the faith that suits our own inclinations. Now, king, thou must choose one or other of these conditions before the thing is ended. After this speech, the people shouted in agreement. Sigurd stepped in and explained that the king did not wish to make enemies of them. They demanded that the king would partake in their pagan tradition, just like his father had before him. And with that, the people calmed down, and the thing was ended. Afterwards, Earl Sigurd and King Haakon talked and came to an agreement that they would have to figure something else out. During the first winter day, a pagan celebration was held, and the king was present. Earlier, when he had been there, he would always stay in a small house away from the festivities. However, this time that would not be good enough. This time, he would have to come in to the main event, and would have to drink in honor of the pagan gods. And so when the horn was offered to him, he signed the cross over it. The pagans saw this and asked what he was doing. Earl Sigurd stepped in and explained that it was not the cross of Christ. He merely did what any man seeking strength does. He signed Thor's hammer over it. This calmed them down, and the rest of the night was uneventful. However, the next day they demanded that the king would eat horse meat. The king refused this. They then told him to taste the horse soup. He again told them no. At this point, they were just about ready to attack him. But once again, Sigurd stepped in and made them come to an agreement. The king would hold his mouth open over the soup so that the steam would go in his mouth. This was done, and both parties were disappointed by this. But outright conflict was avoided. Later the same winter, 8 men agreed to put an end to Christianity once and for all. 4 of them sailed south and killed 3 priests and 3 churches. The other 4 would corner the king and force him to honor the pagan gods. And so when King Haakon came to continue the celebrations, the locals had gathered a large amount of people there, and they forced the king to choose. Either both drink and eat horse in honor of the gods, or they would, quote, give him what worse was, end quote. It ended with the king giving in and eating horse liver, and drank to the pagan gods. Haakon was in a terrible mood after this, and told Sigurd that he would return with an army to get revenge for how they had treated him. He sailed west and stayed there the rest of the winter and spring, and when summer came, he gathered an army, and with this army he intended to return. King Haakon had just stepped on board his ship to sail north, when a messenger from the south came to him. He said that the Ericssons had taken control over large parts of the south. He realized that he needed more men, and sent messages to Earl Sigurd and every other powerful earl he could count on. Earl Sigurd came with a large army, and among them were the chieftains that had been hostile to the king, in forcing him to eat horse meat. They were all forgiven on the spot, and together they sailed south. The two armies met around Karmøy and went to land. Here, a large battle was fought, at a place called Avaldsnes. Both sides fought with extreme ferocity, but by the end, King Haakon and the Norwegians came out on top. The Erikssons were routed and both fleets sailed with all their might, one escaping and one chasing. The Danes set sail out on the open ocean and over to Denmark. King Haakon stopped here and did not give further chase. After this, there was a long period of peace, and the Erikssons stayed in Denmark for a long time. After this battle, a general mobilization was established called the Leidang. This laid out how many ships and men each district would need to contribute in the case of an attack. Along with this, a system of beacons were made ready on top of mountains. These would be lit if an invading army was spotted. This system could mobilize the entire nation from the south to north in just 7 nights. When Haakon had been king for 20 years, the Erikssons again returned. They sailed across the Skagerrak, the strait between Norway and Denmark. However, the beacons were not lit, because normally they would be lit from east to west. And it didn't help that the king had imposed harsh punishments for people who lit the beacons without there being a real threat. In the years leading up to this attack, there had been multiple false alarms. This had been a great inconvenience and costly endeavor, all for nothing. But this time, the threat was very real, and no alarm was raised. The Danish fleet sailed both day and night and got far north. King Haakon was at this time on the island of Frey. He did not have more men with him than his personal guard and the local farmers. Scouts came to Haakon and warned him that there was an opposing army only a short ways away. He immediately called upon the wisest men around to give him advice on what to do. Should they flee north to gather more men, or fight here and now with the men available? An old man was amongst them, Egil. He had been a flag bearer under Haakon's father, Harald Fairhair. He spoke and told the king that during his time under Harald, he sometimes fought with a larger army and sometimes with a smaller, but there was never talk of retreat, and he did not wish to teach the current king that art of fleeing. With this, Haakon had made up his mind. They were going to fight with the men they could gather from the region. An arrow was carved and sent in all directions, as was customary at the time. This arrow alerted everyone that the king was in need of men and that the battle would soon be fought. The old man, Egil, was happy about this and stated that, quote, "I feared during this prolonged time of peace that I would die of old age. But now I might finally die in battle and follow my king." End quote. As soon as the Erikssons got wind in the sails, they continued north. The two armies met on the island of Frey. King Haakon sent a messenger and told them that he had marked up a battlefield on the island. King Haakon and the Norwegians had a total of 9 ships, while the Erikssons and the Danes had more than 20. This was not going to be an easy fight, but Egil had a plan. He asked the king for 10 banners and 10 men. He got it and took them north over a small hill so that they were out of view of the Danish army. Meanwhile, Haakon was busy setting up the army. He made the men form a thinner line than what would be normal. This was to prevent envelopment since he had the smaller army. The opposing armies clashed, and the fighting quickly became fierce. Egil and his 10 men spread out and raised their banners, so that it looked like another army was surrounding them. The Danish army saw this, and one man started shouting about what was afoot, and a general panic gripped the army, and suddenly they were in full retreat. King Haakon and the Norwegians gripped the chance and began to advance, killing many. The Erikssons eventually realized that there were no second army, and that they had been tricked. Upon learning this, they once again raised their banner and tried to rally the men and to form up a line. However, many fled regardless, so many in fact, that at this time the Norwegians had the advantage. The pendulum had swung. The fighting started up again, but it was too little too late. The Erikssons were outnumbered and losing ground by the minute. Once again, the army eventually lost hope and began to flee. There was chaos, men running everywhere trying to get away. The king pursued and cut down many. Amidst the chaos, the Erikssons for the third time formed a line and attempted desperately to turn the tide. And once again the fighting was relentless and many fell on both sides, including the old man Egil. But when Haakon and the main army came to the rescue, the Erikssons were hopelessly outnumbered and fled to the ships. However, by this time, many of the ships were far up on the shore due to the falling tide. The remainder of the army of the Erikssons sailed back to Denmark. The Battle of Rastarkalv was over. After the battle, Haakon had the ships dragged up and burial mounds were made with them, for all the fallen, including Egil. Large stones were also raised in memory of the battle and all the fallen. Both the stones and the hills can still be seen today. The years went on, and Haakon had now been king of Norway for 26 years, and he was at this time on a visit at a place called Fitjar. While the king was eating his breakfast, two men standing guard nearby spotted a large fleet sailing towards them. They talked amongst themselves and wanted to take this to the king, but neither of them wanted to be the one giving the message. But the idea of not telling the king of a possible fleet headed straight towards them seemed worse. The two entered the house the king was in, but did not call for him directly. But instead, they asked for one of the king's closest men to come outside at once, and stressed that time was of the essence. The two guards took him to where the fleet could be seen, and he immediately understood. He went right back to the king and told him what was afoot. The king and all his men rushed out to see the fleet, and upon confirming that this was in fact warships, King Haakon turned and asked his men whether they should stand and fight or attempt to flee north. None of the men spoke up, and there was a brief silence before the king's poet broke the silence with a poem that supported the idea of fighting, even if that meant to the bitter end. Haakon liked this poet and told him that, quote, "This was the speech of a brave man, and I like this, and in line with what I myself think. However, I wish to hear other people's opinion on this matter." End quote. The men were emboldened by this, and they began to voice their support, to stand their ground and to fight, come what may. King Haakon thanked them for their support, and the order was given to arm themselves for battle. A banner was raised and a line formed. The king himself wore a golden helmet, along with a chainmail armor, sword and spear. Harald Eriksson was now the leader of the Erikssons. They sailed into the island, came ashore and formed up in battle formation. Once the Danes and the Erikssons came ashore, it became apparent to the king that they were now outnumbered by 6-1. Once King Haakon saw the true size of the opposing army, he took off his chainmail armor to further rally the men. The distance was closed, and once in range, spears were thrown. The two armies clashed, and the fighting right away became fierce and bloody. King Haakon was right up in front of the heat of battle, and he was also easy to spot because of his golden helmet. As a result, many men pointed their weapons towards him. One of his own men grabbed him and made him cover up the helmet to not be so visible. A man yelled out, quote, "Has he gone into hiding now, the Northmen's king? Or has he fled? Where is the golden helmet?" End quote. He and another man charged forward like madmen, swinging both sides. King Haakon responded to this, quote, "Continue forward as you are if you wish to meet the Northmen's king." End quote. It wasn't long before the two men clashed. However, Haakon got the advantage when his opponent was pushed by accident by a friendly and briefly lost his balance, but Haakon gripped the moment and grabbed his sword in both hands, swinging it hard. So hard in fact that it cut through his helmet and his head all the way down to his shoulders. After this, he quickly struck down the other man standing nearby. The king surged forth, and men avoided him now at all costs. After seeing this, the army was soon gripped by fear. And then, once again, the rout began. The battle was quickly coming to a close. The Erikssons were now in full retreat, and King Haakon and his men were right on their heels. Suddenly, an arrow came flying and hit Haakon right in the arm below the shoulder. It is said that it was fired by one of Gunhild's servants that ran out in front of one of the boats and yelled out, quote, "Make way for the king killer," End quote. Others say that no one knows truly who shot the arrow, since spears and arrows both were flying close like a snowstorm. Many men fell on the side of the Erikssons, but many also got away to the ships, and so Haakon and his army gave chase. The Battle of Fitjar ended in a Norwegian hard-fought victory. Haakon boarded one of his longships and placed a bandage over his wound. However, it did not stop bleeding, and later in the day he lost his strength. He told his men that he wished to travel home to one of his farms just outside of modern Bergen. They had to stop just short of their destination because the king was close to death. They all went on land, and here he called to him all his friends and told them what his wishes was for the kingdom. Since he had only a daughter and no sons, he was going to give up his kingdom to the Erikssons, and told them to be good to his friends and relatives. King Haakon I of Norway spoke his last line in the King's Saga, quote, "And should I be so fortunate that I survive and live longer, I still wish to leave this land and travel to Christian lands, and atone for my sins against God. But if I do die here, in pagan land, then you shall bury me as you see fit." A short time after this, the king drew his last breath and died. After his death, there was such a sorrow over the nation that both his friends and enemies alike mourned his passing, and it was said that never again would Norway have a king as good as him. His body was taken north to Seim, where they built a large burial mound where they buried him along with his weapons and best clothes. Like the custom was, they spoke above his grave the words that would take him to Valhall. And with this, the saga of King Haakon I of Norway, better known as Haakon the Good, ends. Thank you for watching. This is truly my passion to make videos about this topic, and if you would like the video and subscribe, that would mean a lot in helping me make more of these kinds of videos about topics I really enjoy. And once again, thank you for watching.